Hey everyone, welcome to day 3 of Energy Week. We've been having a great time with, or at least I've been having a great time learning about many things going on at UT regarding energy and also in the world. So I'm Brian Corgle. I'm the director of the Energy Institute at University of Texas at Austin, and looking forward to kicking off day 3. So this morning we've got a keynote talk from John Berger, CEO of Sonova Energy International, as well as a series of panels all the way from hydrogen. We've got a panel on grid resilience that's being moderated by Mose Buchel from KUT. That I'm looking forward to that. A panel on industrial decarbonization, funding for startups in the energy space. So that should be great. I want to give a shout out real quick to a smart energy innovation program that we have going on that kicked off last week in E-Week, so Engineers Week. It's co-sponsored by Affinity Energy, Shell, and Chevron, and an organization on campus called Genesis is helping run that. It's a student competition. There's a $50,000 of funding available for students to pitch their startups and spend several months developing their ideas. It's a really great program, so I encourage students from all different majors to get involved. You can be an engineering major, art major, you can be a communications major, whatever you want. So I'm really looking forward to that happening also this year. Really excited about it. All right, so let's get back to our keynote. So John Berger is CEO of Sonova Energy International. He founded Sonova in 2012 and has since then served as Chief Executive Officer, President, and Chairman of the Board. With more than 2 decades of experience in the electric power industry, Mr. Berger is an energy entrepreneur who's always supported free market competition, consumer choice, and the advancement of energy technology to power energy independence. Before Sonova, Mr. Berger served as founder and chief executive officer at SunCap Financial, a residential solar service provider. He also founded Standard Renewable Energy, a provider and installer of renewable energy and energy efficient products and services. Mr. Berger received his Master of Business Administration from Harvard Business School and graduated cum laude from Texas A&M University with a Bachelor of Science degree in civil engineering. So really looking forward to hearing John's thoughts on the great energy transition, and there will be plenty of time for questions after his remarks. So please, if you have questions, throw them in the chat and we will ask them to John. I'll turn it over to John. Thanks again, John, for being here.
Thank you, Brian. And it's great to be here with everybody, at least virtually. As Brian said, I'm John Berger, founder and CEO of Sonova Energy International. We are a residential energy service provider. So we started out doing solar only, then we've added batteries, we've added lately EV charging, load management's coming, and generators, and you get the picture. There's a lot of different pieces of what we do starting to come to the marketplace, and then integrate those together as hardware with some software from us, and then providing service just like a utility. So one way to think about us is a wireless power company. We span from Guam, Saipan, which is near Japan, all the way through Hawaii, California, Texas, Puerto Rico, and then as far north as Massachusetts and New Hampshire. We will probably be in all territories, save maybe the Virgin Islands, sometime by next year, and for the large part, be there by the end of this year. So we've got a wide geography. We say grace of roughly about 200,000 customers across this geography, primarily in the West in California, in the Northeast, and in the Caribbean with Puerto Rico. We do have a very large balance sheet in the sense that we've kept a long-term contracted cash flows. So again, one way to look at us is as a utility, if you will, with long-term 25-year recurring cash flows that we have then accumulated and generating recurring operating cash for to the shareholders in the business. We went public in 2019, and it's been quite a ride. Some both ups and downs, but it's been mostly up, so that's great. In terms of our business model, the last aspect that I would really emphasize is that we are a dealer-based business model, which means that we have locally owned and operated contractors that go out and originate and install on our behalf. We do upsell existing customers batteries and so forth from direct sales desk every once in a while. And then the other thing is we provide service, and we talked about last week in our earnings call, where we talked about moving towards a 24-hour turnaround service. So again, something that you'd be much more used to with your electric utility. And indeed, as we think about each home becoming a nanogrid or a small utility, somebody's got to be there to fix all the problems that do occur and make sure the power flows. And so that is us. We're talking about the energy transition. I do think that given the events last week, the invasion of Ukraine, energy is on the minds where it typically is not for most people. We did see crude, I think this morning, hit $111 a barrel. Natural gas is moving up and has moved up tremendously. In Europe, it's trading as high as $50 an MMBTU, and certainly has been in that 30 to 40 range for the last at least 4 months. To give you some perspective, at the hub here in the United States, roughly about, I think, around $4.70. So that was about $2 to $2.50 for the longest time. So energy is becoming much more expensive, bottom line. And we see that moving forth in much higher utility rates across the country. We expect to see significantly higher utility rates in Texas and beyond as we move forward into the year. We've seen some eye-popping rate increases of 20+% already in the year. Has just gotten started. So that adds another dimension to what we'll talk about here over the next few minutes. But if I had to say that there's 3 reasons for the energy transition, the first and foremost is that there is an increased amount of demand for energy around the world, and there's an increased demand for reliability. You see this as you look for storage, for generators for homes. This got highlighted in the pandemic where everybody started at least doing some work from home. You got to have connectivity and you got to have power. And so more and more, if you look at the trends out there, more and more people are getting home generation for that purpose. And so increasing reliability as climate change impacts our climate, nasty hurricanes, which we've certainly seen here in Houston, and wildfires in California and Colorado and Arizona, and the list goes on and on. And that goes into the second one, which is climate change. And up until last week, that really was a big driver. It obviously is a crisis and a disaster across the globe, and certainly a crisis for humanity. And how we deal with this problem of both supplying demand or supplying the energy that is being demanded by consumers across the globe, particularly as that demand increases, but at the same time, not suffer from the aftermath, pretty significant aftermath of pollution from consuming those hydrocarbons to power our lives. And so that's is a crisis and something that we feel deeply about. We can be a part of the solution on. But at the same time, I think that what you'll hear out of us that maybe is a little different from others is that there has to be a balance. We use natural gas in our generators. We have a very firm view that there is going to have to be a transition here because you can't, literally can't put solar panels on everybody's home by the end of this year or even the end of the next year. So there's got to be something here that transitions us. And that leads into the last problem that has been staring at us in the face and frankly, been thinking about for quite a while, but now everybody has become front of mind and really trying to get their head around it, which is, oil and gas is often used by regimes that, are not friendly to democracy and certainly not friendly to freedom. And you're seeing that play out in real time, unfortunately, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is definitely causing the spike in which I think will be a surge, not a spike. I think it's going to continue to move higher in oil, natural gas, coal, et cetera. And so that's exacerbating these other situations and causing more problems on top of problems that we just mentioned in the terms of increased demand for reliability, climate change. And that's going to be with us for a long, long time. And so as you look forward in terms of Texas and how Sonova was founded in Houston. There's still a lot of chuckles that go around about that, about a solar company being in the oil and gas capital of the world. But I think it's really goes to the point is that Houston is changing, Texas is changing, and why limit ourselves to just being the oil and gas capital of the world? Why don't we go ahead and own all of the energy? And by the way, include all of Texas in that as well. And then indeed, we're making big strides to that. The relocation of Tesla's headquarters to Austin was a significant step forward. Tesla, by the way, is a very important partner of ours. We buy more of their batteries for homes than any other company in the world. And so it was a big move to welcome them to Texas. It's a big move to have us grow up in Houston in the backyard of oil and gas country and really embrace, if you will, the energy, culture and landscape. And I will tell you this, that Sonova wouldn't be Sonova today and successful without Houston. It's demographic diversity, it's low cost structure, and it's deep talented pool of people that really understand energy. And so these are all assets for us to work with as we look forward to changing the way that Texas thinks about energy and essentially broaden our thoughts, our horizons, as far as what we can do in Texas and what should be included in the Texan energy business. And if you look at a big part of this are the universities. Obviously, I went to the other university, as Brian mentioned, but University of Texas has been on the forefront of the energy transition and renewable energy, and is certainly a very much an important part of making Texas the leader in the energy transition and renewable energy. University of Houston is also a big part and has got a lot of focus on the energy side of things, as well as other universities in Texas. But for the workforce that we need, these universities like University of Texas and right down the road from us is something that is really instrumental into making sure that we can have the talent to continue to grow the business at the kind of rate we're growing at and to change the world of energy and change Texas with it. When you look at overall what our vision of the future is, and I think this is interesting, a lot of people spend most of the time thinking about how to take what we have today, internal combustion engines, for instance, filling up at gas stations along the highway, electric utilities that are centralized that burn natural gas and combined cycle units that are umpteen miles away in the middle of nowhere, or coal, or a nuclear plant, or in some cases wind farms and solar farms and so forth. And how do you take a look at those models and say, it's not just making those green. It's not just taking the coal plant and putting it in a wind farm in its place. It's not just taking a electric vehicle and then putting a charging station on the side of the highway and expecting it all to just be the same. And a lot of people view it that way. And I don't think that's the right way to view it at all. I think with these new technologies, specifically solar and batteries, for the first time in the energy business's history, what you have is a distributed fuel source, the sun, and you have a distributed efficient conversion technology taking that raw BTU, sunlight, and moving it and converting it into electricity, so kilowatt hour, megawatt hour. And before that, you'd really had much more of it. It had to be a centralized fuel source, Niagara Falls in the first major power plant, for instance, or a coal source, a coal mine mouth operation, major natural gas pipeline, and then it was certainly a much more efficient conversion to take a very large plant, convert it into electricity, and then wire it out to all the different homes and businesses over miles and miles. And now you have a different set of technologies, and each of these, as you combine them with software and then a service like ours, is enabling new business models to be formed. And again, as I said earlier, you might want to think of us as a wireless power company, but indeed that's the vision, is how do you have solar, batteries, maybe a generator, but load management, EV charging, other technologies all wired together, if you will, with software, with a single app. You can call it a single pane of glass that you go in and see. And it's backed up by somebody that knows what they're doing, how to fix things, and can get to that house pretty quickly if something goes wrong. If they can't remote diagnose the problem and fix the problem. And that's a totally different business model. It's more of a distributed utility, if you will, versus the centralized utility. The other side of that is increasingly we are the gas station. The home is the gas station, is maybe a bit, more direct way of putting it. And you're not filling up the electric vehicle on the side of the road. So that's a completely different model. And a lot of things that we do on the electric vehicle side of things, maybe we stop and get lunch on a trip, and we charge up during that period of time versus running out to a couple of gas stations on the way there and filling up with a few minutes. So these are things that are completely different models that you really think through. Obviously, incumbents are very threatened by these changes. We deal with the utilities all the time on that front. But those same kind of threats are also opportunities, and particularly for you all, these are tremendous opportunities, both in the sense of going to work for a company like Sonova, coming out of school, or founding your own company, and coming up with a different way of doing, more efficient way of doing things, and embracing the technology. And that's something that I think Texas is really good about in the energy business. Was the fracking revolution of a few years ago. We look at how could it be done better, and we get after it, and we come up with new and better ways and better business models. And so I'm quite confident we'll see a lot of innovation and change as we move forward in this energy transition. Lastly, I would say that there is a growing amount of interest into having self-reliance of energy, and in the growing amount of problems that climate change brings about, storms, the utilities cutting power in other areas like California based on wildfires, even geopolitical uncertainty gives people more comfort to say, I could power my house without having to be dependent upon a centralized system and so forth. And again, that's a long-term trend, and that's something that we see, energy independence. And I think that's really, when you say energy independence, it's almost something that's very Texan about that, is how do you do energy well, and then at the same time, what's a word that describes Texans more than independent? And so that's something that we focus on quite a bit. We see a big trend in that, and we see a lot more, like I said earlier, innovation that can happen around as we move forward in the energy transition. And lastly, before we get into Q&A, what I would say is that the events, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there's no question that most of that war machine is powered by minerals, and including oil and gas, especially oil and gas, and we're looking to limit that through sanctions and so forth. It really brings home the importance of how do we have an independent country that can supply its own energy, not just with oil and gas, which has been the old way of thinking about, but also with renewable energy. And how can we make, as has been put by the Europeans, renewable energy be freedom energy? It doesn't mean that we're going to not need natural gas anytime soon, or even oil, and unfortunately probably even coal anytime soon. It means that we move forward in figuring out how do we speed up the adoption of renewable energy like solar and batteries, and how do we make sure that we have enough adequate energy supplies so that we can function as a country and move forward, and not be under the thumb of people like Putin. And that's going to cause, I predict, a very much an interest in accelerating the energy transition. Should it have been climate change alone that would cause that interest? I would argue yes. But I think those two combinations, both climate change and needing to address that, and the geopolitical issues that now have been highlighted about how risky the global energy business really is, particularly with regards to national security, those things are going to be driving forward. And then from now on, and accelerating a movement towards an energy transition and self-reliance as a country for our energy needs. So lots of opportunity. I predict the next few years, the next 10, 15 years is going to be really a golden age for energy transition, and something that would be hard pressed to find anywhere else in the economy as far as starting your career, to find anything more exciting, more probably economically advantageous for you, but most importantly, we're here to change the world and for the better. And there's a lot of problems out there. These two in particular that we've talked about, changing consumer demands. And so there's a real mission here in life about how to make the world a better place. And I would hope each of you, whether it's with Sonova or with another company, your own company that you found, really embark upon that journey and help us change the world. So with that, I think turn it back over to Brian, but happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Really insightful messages, I guess, about the energy transition. I'll start off with my first question. I mean, founding a solar company in 2012, at that time period, what sort of insanity was that all about? I mean, if you know anything about the solar industry, there was a big crash sort of around that time. I'm just curious about the inception of Sonova and what some of your thoughts were to get into it at that time. I mean, it's pretty interesting, and then to see the solar industry thrive and take off the way it has over the last 10 years. Love to hear your insights about that.
Yeah, I think I've been in the power business now, so the energy business, for 26 years. And I always found, since I was, a boy, that energy business is exciting. I mean, it was a bit of romantic, you get to go off in far-flung areas of the world, and you get to do really neat things. And you see the entrepreneurs, many of which, greatly contributed to the development of University of Texas and Texas A&M, having commercial success and obviously donating a large part of those monies back into the universities to invest in the future of Texas. And so there's something really cool about that. And then you look at, what was going on when I started getting into power trading and so forth after I graduated from A&M. It was clear to me that we were way, way overdue as a species, but as a country, for a big change in energy, and both for stationary and transportation. And as you move forward in time and realize, this is early O's, right? More and more of, my gosh, this climate change thing is really real. There's a real problem here. And so that's another, I think I'm understating it clearly, but tailwind, if you will. But overall, I also realized that the geopolitics of energy were getting worse. And I remember, not shortly after I got to Harvard Business School, 9/11 happened. And, we were really dealing with wars in the Middle East and so forth. And you could just see that these issues, China's rise, saw that coming and saw that we're going to consume a lot more. India's rise as well. That's all become true. And so when you look at all these different trends, huge demand increase, pollution causing massive threats to humanity, the geopolitical issues that go around with having certain people have control of those resources that are necessary for life on Earth. These are the kind of things that you go, wow, there's a big opportunity here. So if there's a small quote crash, and there's all kinds of things like everybody's trying to figure out even today about what the different business models I was referencing are going to be successful in solar and so forth. And so it's the Wild West. I mean, we're settling it. At least now you can see the vagaries of maybe a St. Louis, and you definitely got San Francisco and a little bit of what becomes Dallas Fort Worth and so forth, to just kind of give you an idea. But it's still we've started to see some outline of what that success will look like, and that's also going to be met with some cycles. We certainly have seen them even in the last 3 months, where you've got a lot of optimism and then suddenly a lot of pessimism, and then the optimism will come back, and that's just part of being an entrepreneur. So you just look through those kind of times that you referenced when you're starting the company and go, I know the fundamentals, I know the long-term trend. This too shall pass, and let's just push on through it. And the last part I would add, into that is Texas. I mean, let's be honest. A lot of people chuckle even more and saying, "Well, what were you doing putting a solar company in Houston? Like, what happened? Were you unemployed permanently? I mean, what were you thinking? You didn't have a choice?" And it really was more about that. Like I said earlier, Houston in Texas is a great place to be. It's a great low cost area to grow a business, and the people are wonderful. The people are very diverse as well, which has been a huge boom for us in our business, particularly in Spanish speaking areas like Puerto Rico and others areas. And so there's a lot of positive aspects. There's much more positives about it. It just seems right to me, but for other people looking in outside and like, I don't get it. But as you can see, and I'm much more bullish about Texas' future in the energy transition. These things that are core to us, our assets, are really going to make us very, very successful here in owning not just the existing energy industry, but the new energy industry as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so I direct a solar research center, and Sonova is part of that, and that's that sort of thing. And we've been doing that for the last 12 years or so. So I've seen the industry grow, and it's really remarkable. You mentioned some of the new technologies. I mean, solar plus storage. If you combine electric vehicles, I mean, I really think in the last year or two has the beginning of a technological revolution. I mean, in terms of what's available. I was trying to remember if this was, I think 2020 was one of the first announcements of grid utility scale storage plus solar. At really low cost came online. I think when we saw that, we were like, wow, that just blowing everything open. So you've got um, these connections between transportation, how we live, how we get our power. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you've been in, since 2012, Sonova was started. I mean, how have you seen technology progress, and do you think anything's different now at this particular time period than, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's been a general trend that you get about 10 watts of energy density pickup on solar modules every 9 months, maybe 12 months. Last year, it was 50 watts. So it was a step function change. There are other technologies that are out there that are starting to become more real in the solar module area, and we'll see what happens. But and the general trend has been up, and it's accelerating. To your point, Brian, I think the most exciting area is on the storage side of things, and that's really coming into its own very, very fast. I remember as little as 2.5 years ago having a big debate with others that looked at storage and said it's never going to happen. In fact, I think there's some award-winning chemists and so forth around, say, Texas that said it was never going to happen. And then the next year, I was buying, massive sums of batteries, from Tesla and others, but mostly Tesla. And I was like, well, that didn't last long in terms of that naysaying. So you're seeing a significant scale up, to say the least, and there's different chemistries, NMC, LiFo on the lithium ion, but you're also starting to hear more and more and see more companies on the solid state lithium. And I do think that eventually happens here. The question is when. The interesting thing about it is, as you go back, is as they say, necessity is the mother of invention, right? We now have, if we couldn't get everybody on the same page and really energize them, pardon the pun, to address climate change and see as the emergency that it is, again, going back into it, Putin's invasion of Ukraine really is going to highlight this. And so when you have hydrocarbon prices at historic levels, where I think of where we're going, you're going to incent a lot of people, and you're sending a signal across that everybody gets in the country that, hey, we've got a real emergency. We need to be all in on R&D. We need to be all in getting the technologies out the door as fast as possible, and the money is more money than you need, frankly, is there to be able to do that. So I think this is a culmination of events and fundamentals, not just a passage of some bill by some president of whatever party, and subsidy, whatever you want to call it, but also just the fundamentals of the market and these fundamental trends that we're talking about. They're going to accelerate the technology over the next from here to the next few years. We're quite bullish on the technology change.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the solid state batteries, we had a panel yesterday about the energy innovation ecosystem in Austin, and with 4 CEOs of startups, and one of the CEOs, T. Egan from Energy X, they're trying to extract lithium, from produced water and things like that, but also looking at solid state electrolytes. So that's definitely a really interesting area. Got a question in the chat. So I guess this relates to policy. The question is, what's the lasting effect of the Trump photovoltaic tariffs? Did they actually increase U.S. photovoltaic manufacturing? Are they still in place?
Yeah. So I'm much more, as you introduced me, is much more focused on freedom all the way across, freedom to choose your provider. I don't like being told that you can have this monopoly utility and that's all you get. I think people ought to have choice, and hopefully they choose Sonova, but that's my job to earn that business, right? But it should be a fundamental right that you have the ability to choose, who you want to have as a service provider. And you should have a fundamental right to have freedom and open access to markets. And I'm not going to waver from that. And I've found it to be, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, have wandered off in the desert on these kind of things. And what I also say is tariffs have never worked in any civilization or any structure of government for 2,000 years. So why do we keep trying them? I mean, it's the definition of insanity. And I made that point to the Trump administration. But the first tariffs were actually put under the Obama administration. And this is something that, it's really interesting. Candidly, I made more money personally under Trump. And then a lot of my friends in oil and gas have made a ton more money in 1 year under Biden than they did in 4 years under Trump. And I guarantee you, we didn't vote for the same person in the last election. And so there's a lot of interesting counterintuitive things that go on here, and trade policy is one of them. So yeah, President Obama put the first tariff in place. The behind the scenes was that was a response by the break-in of a certain facility, solar module facility in the West Coast, by the Chinese government stealing plans. And so it was a retaliation for that. And that's why you didn't see a whole lot of retaliation. The Chinese, they're kind of like, okay, we deserved it. Let's move on. Trump, on the other hand, put something in place that was, from their view, not warranted. And I agree with them. And it certainly wasn't effective. And that was another set of tariffs that were put in place. And then President Biden has continued some of those various tariffs. In fact, for the first time in the country's history, a Section 201 tariff was extended a few days ago. And look, I think the facts speak for themselves. Tariffs do not work, as I mentioned, but what does work is incentives. And we're going to need to put incentives to buy the semiconductor business back from the Taiwanese. And we did so before with the Japanese, and actually Austin was instrumental in that. We need to do that on the solar module side and the battery side of things. And so I think a manufacturing subsidy of some sort to really get things kick-started here in this country is something that's necessary. I'm not a big subsidy fan at all, but we're dealing with governments that are basically acting in ways that are not capitalistic. And I do see, talking to some of the political leaders of the state on both the D and the R side, obviously mostly on the R and state of Texas, that there is a view on that. Get out of the way, hate subsidies, hate them. However, if that's the way the opponents want to play, and we have to play that game too. So that's a better way of going about doing this. And tariffs are something that continually hang over our head all the time, and it could be a problem. I mean, right now you're seeing utility scale solar and storage drop from the levels of the last year under the Trump administration tremendously. And a big part of this is because of tariffs on the solar panel side of things. So we've been able to navigate that. There's some economic reasons why we can afford to pay more for the panels and so forth than the utility scale can, but it's been a real problem, continues to be a real issue. And the long-term solution is let's pass some subsidies, get the manufacturers, start building a base here in this country, create the jobs here, and then remove the tariffs and let the competitive landscape work.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Do you happen to know if there's any funding going to be set aside in the infrastructure bill that can help bring some of that solar manufacturing, back to the U.S. or help support it?
There was not in the infrastructure bill. There was in the Build Back Better, which is now, I think, pretty well known to be dead. And there's some of this in the what they call the Competes bill, which was put together to essentially compete with China. It's not the country's not named there, but we all know who we're competing against in manufacturing, and it was really centered around the semiconductor industry. But we're the close cousin of the semiconductor business, with a direct overlap in many cases on the solar module side. So that's something that's been in Congress right now. There's a good likelihood that I personally think and have thought for the last 3 weeks that we'll actually get an energy bill. And yes, it's because of the invasion in Ukraine. And you're starting to see some of that over the last 48, 72 hours, mention of that on both sides of the aisle. So I think hopefully we'll get something in that bill that would incent manufacturing of solar modules, batteries, et cetera, to come here in the United States. Of course, we want it here in Texas as much as we can get. We want it here in Texas.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if there's any role you think UT Austin can play in that, please send me a couple emails. Happy to help. Another question from the chat. So, in terms of EV charging, so you mentioned, it's a fascinating way to look at solar. It's a distributed energy resource. You're not driving to the gas pump. You're basically your house is the filling station for the most part, and that opens up a lot of opportunities, including like using your battery to connect to the grid, for example. So, when do you think technologies like vehicle to grid, vehicle to home start to become a mainstream reality, and maybe what role do you suggest the auto manufacturers can play in that?
Well, that it's interesting. As recently as I would say a couple of years ago, maybe 18 months ago, folks like Elon really didn't believe in vehicle to building charging, and so bidirectional essentially is the way the phrase is. And now that's totally changed. Ford has even had commercials during the Super Bowl, right, about, take the F-150 Lightning and charge your home and so forth. So it's definitely part of what we're working on, is to, think about this simple. Your home needs to go off grid. Power's not there. It's more economical to do it, whatever it is, for that period of time. You're charging your electric vehicle. What happens? Do you have enough energy there to do both at the same time? Is that vehicle actually discharging, so it enables you to because something else happened to the batteries that were attached directly to your house? I mean, these are the current challenges that we're grappling with, but they're also clearly opportunities. And on this particular issue, some of the things that we're working on, specifically with ChargePoint, and that relationship there. Also, you're looking at some innovations coming out of Tesla and some of the other ESS, or the energy storage systems. These are the batteries, effectively, the Powerwall, et cetera, from Tesla, Generac, SolarEdge, and others out there. So it's definitely happening. And what's interesting is consumer demand. It's so exciting about powering your house with your car is pushing us all to do something here that we wouldn't have thought about otherwise doing. Saying, we got so much more to do over here and get this to work, and solar and just storage, and consumers like, no, but I want this. And again, the environment here with energy pricing and so forth is going to accelerate this as well. So it's something we're working on. It's not quite there yet to really even do in a test case, but I predict it's going to, something's going to come that's going to make this, something that we roll out to our customers within the next 24 months.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, a question I get a lot from the public, which I think I understand, but maybe you can weigh in on this. You mentioned how you interact with utilities and that sort of thing. A lot of homeowners were wondering why they have solar panels on their roof, but during Uri, when the power went out, the solar panels wouldn't generate any power. Can you explain what that's all about?
Yeah, so years and years ago, the utilities, under the guise of not wanting to have a lineman work on a line that was down and have it, backflow, if you will, and shock the lineman or kill them, said that you cannot have inverters. You basically have to be inline inverters that when the grid goes down, they go down too. Now, it is also true that for over 20 years, we've had the technology to deal with that issue and be able to have, fully functioning homes that form their own grid forming, if you will, and not have a backflow problem. So why were those rules to this day still in place? Anti-competitive behavior by the utilities. They don't like when people don't buy the amount of power that they would like us to buy. And that has created the situation where we had to deal a lot with in Puerto Rico and Maria, which is, and I get it. Hey, the panels are on my roof. Why didn't the power just come straight down here? And that's the reason why. Now, there's been some innovation in that you've taken what was the an off-grid inverter, if you will, and made it to where you can produce power and just have the sun and not have a battery and have that power flow into your house. And so basically working around some of the, I wouldn't say working around, but basically, having technology that addresses the issues of the utility regulation, but at the same time enables you to basically, have power when the grid goes down with just solar panels. The problem is that technology, to your question earlier, has moved on. And now batteries are getting cheaper and cheaper, much more available. And so it's like, well, why would I want to do that? Because, the problem you're going to have is a cloud moves across the sun, boom, your house goes down, right? There's no storage capability of it. So again, these are still intermittent resource here. And so most people, like 99.9% of the people are just going to go like, just give me a battery. And then we'll figure out how much of the house I want to back up. I personally have been the long-term believer in whole home backup versus doing partial circuits and so forth. So it's much due to technological change in the battery side of things and the ramping up, so dropping of the cost of the batteries is to the point where it's just like, and we do this a lot and increasingly so, is go back to those solar only customers and say, hey, why don't we sign you up for a battery or two?
Awesome. Well, that's going to do it. John, thanks so much for giving that keynote and answering all those questions. And I really enjoyed hearing all your perspectives all the way from technology, business creation, policy. So really appreciate it. Thanks again, John.
Thanks
All
for
right, so
having
we're
me.
gonna
And by the way, we're hiring. We're hiring lots of folks. So for those of you who want to join the revolution, if you will, please come see us. But thank you for having me, Brian. I really enjoyed it.
yeah. Thanks again. All right, so we're gonna move on to our next panel, which is on hydrogen storage and power sector.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Evan Fry. I'm a physical scientist with the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm going to be serving as your moderator today. And I'm going to be joined here with a diverse panel on the subsurface and surface technologies with Peter, Mojta, Kevin, and Reed. And as the previous speaker said, yeah, they're all joining. Hey, everyone. So this session is going to cover hydrogen storage. So for hydrogen economy at scale, proven and cost-effective hydrogen storage technologies and solutions are needed that cover short and long-term storage needs. This will include a range of surface and subsurface storage technologies, each with specific target applications and for a range and storage durations. This session will address current hydrogen storage technologies, as well as technology development needs and opportunities from the reservoir engineering, geologic, tank design and manufacturing, and energy economic perspectives. If we could actually move to the previous slide, please. Yeah, so hi, I'm Evan Fry. As I said, I'm a physical scientist with the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and it's a real privilege to be here with UT Energy Week. Next slide, please. So in terms of who we are and what we do, as you may know, we're now the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, which reflects our new vision to achieve decarbonization and carbon management. Our office works to support administration goals, which include a 50% reduction by 2030 in emissions, CO2 emissions-free power sector by 2035, net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050, and as the graphic on the right illustrates, it's a depiction of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector, and we convene here today to consider hydrogen-enabled technologies and energy pathways to strategically reduce emissions within the domestic energy economy. Next slide, please. Thanks. So FECM has taken a step back to consider both legacy and current impacts of fossil fuels and develop our new mission, which represents the most significant change in our office since its inception. We look to minimize environmental impacts of fossil fuels and achieve the net zero emission goals that I previously discussed. Both the reduction of CO2 and a removal of CO2 from legacy emissions is critical. You know, there's this accumulated pool of CO2 in the atmosphere, and this will be critical in achieving net zero emission goals. This applies not to just the ways we extract, deliver, and use fossil fuels today, but it also applies to the process emissions associated with the industrial sectors, such as cement, steel, and refining. Research and development, demonstration, and deployment, RD&D, of decarbonization technologies will drive the critical energy transition needed to get to net zero by 2050. FECM is committed to improving the conditions of communities impacted by legacy fossil fuel use and supporting healthy economic transitions that accelerate the growth of good-paying domestic jobs. Next slide, please. So some of you may be familiar with this. From a department coordination perspective, we present the H2 at scale model. This highlights clean hydrogen potential for integration into a domestic energy economy and serve as a more ubiquitous carbon-free energy carrier. From an FECM perspective, fossil fuels have a long-established role within the overall energy economy. When we think of hydrogen as a carbon-free fuel and fossil resources in the existing infrastructure that can be leveraged to provide clean hydrogen at scales, we need to evaluate their potential to leverage these assets. Next slide, please. So this is a depiction of our 2020 hydrogen program plan that the department uses to enable clean hydrogen technologies at competitive costs in order to decarbonize the power, transportation, and industrial sectors. This plan highlights near-term and longer-term R&D across areas of interest, including production, delivery, storage, conversion, and end-use applications. Clean hydrogen is currently more expensive than most conventional fuels, so to further penetrate each of these market sectors, DOE and its partners must strategize towards lowering the cost of clean hydrogen utilization. Next slide, please. So from an FECM, fossil energy and carbon management perspective, this slide provides a high-level overview of potential near, mid, and long-term R&D opportunities. In the near term, we continue to work with across DOE offices to understand market opportunities and challenges in various regions of the United States to best deploy federal resources. In the midterm, scaling up the subsurface storage of hydrogen is of specific interest, and for conversation here today, we welcome inputs as we plan out-year activities. In the longer term, understanding FECM's role is critical towards maintaining and achieving the administration's goals in providing safe, reliable, and secure energy resources to the American public. Next slide. Just as we transition, you know, as young scientists or young future scientists, we just want to also make a pitch. The administration has established the Clean Energy Corps, which will provide thousands of job opportunities to work at the department. So please reach out to me directly or engage the panel here further to learn more information. The Clean Energy Jobs Corps is conducting interviews over the next few months. And as I said, thousands of job opportunities across fossil, renewable, nuclear, all aspects of the energy landscape. So just wanted to throw a pitch out there. But let's transition to our first speaker, Professor Peter Eichel. of the Bureau of Economic Geology. Peter, over to you.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Evan, for the introduction. I am a geologist at the University of Texas at Austin, and I have 3 slides here to prime you, so to speak, why geologists are even thinking about hydrogen and hydrogen storage. I'm not an economist, but even without being an economist, we know why we need storage. We need storage to even out variations in differences in supply and demand. Why do we need hydrogen? The advantage, no carbon emissions at the end user. That does not mean that we don't have carbon emissions at the source. That depends how we produce the hydrogen. It's a carrier. It's not a source of energy like hydrocarbons. But the reason we are interested in hydrogen is it allows us to adapt our current modus operandi that we have with oil and gas. To some extent, we can transport in pipelines and we can store it in tanks and in the subsurface. And the subsurface is where the geology actually comes in. So the first 2 panelists, and one after me, Professor Delshad, we will talk about the subsurface side, and the other panelists about the surface side. Just to clarify the need for storage, with an increasing demand, supply in variable energy generation, or as the prior speaker said, called it freedom energy, we have this mismatch in generation and consumption, which is shown in the top right slide, which is the infamous duck curve, which is variations in daily variable energy generation, wind and solar, for day in California, I guess, with peak generation during the day and then peak demand in the evening hours. So there's a mismatch there, but that also applies to the monthly and yearly time scale, as shown in the lower right. This is just a simulation, but a group looking at if variable energy generation would be 100% of our energy source, how the differences in summer and winter production and use would have to be evened out by storage. We don't want to have the capacity to produce wind and solar energy meeting the peak demand hours. That would be a waste of resources. We want to store that excess generated energy and then use it when the demand is the highest. So that is primarily where geological storage comes in. It's the longer term storage. It is the seasonal storage and perhaps monthly storage primarily. Next slide. Or do I do this myself? I guess I do it myself, yes. So just as an overview here, there are different technologies to store hydrogen, and they can be divided into groups, surface and subsurface. And this table has been a little bit messed up in the upload, but the last column here is the working capacity. And yeah, I apologize for that. The table got messed up. But what we can store in the subsurface is orders of magnitudes larger than what you can store at the surface in tanks. That's where the subsurface comes in. But that doesn't mean that subsurface is necessarily better. It's just depending on the usage, how fast we need to retrieve it, where we want to have the storage. Is it for a fueling station? Is it for an industrial plant? Is it for meeting national demand, strategic demand? That's where different storage technologies come in. And there are 3 types of geological storage. One is using rock caverns, and I won't mention this. It's a niche way. It's basically having a surface storage, but it's built into the rock. But the other ones are what's called salt cavern storage, where we drill a hole in the ground and we pump water in and dissolve salt and create a cavern by dissolution. And that middle diagram shows you a 3D view of that. The caverns can be huge. They can, you could fit the Empire State Building into one of those. And you can have multiple caverns in one salt body in the subsurface. And that is being practiced in Texas at 3 locations currently. And the other option is to store hydrogen in porous reservoirs in the subsurface, sandstones, formations that are either filled with hydrocarbons today and then produced and depleted, or that contain saline water what we call saline aquifers. Because the hydrogen is buoyant, there needs to be a tight rock formation on top of it. We call it the cap rock, and it needs to have a normal structure so that the hydrogen does not escape out of that structure. And that's what we call porous reservoir storage, and it can be either a depleted oil and gas field or it can be a saline aquifer. So those are complementary approaches, and the geological storage is the salt cavern storage is actually a low-cost option overall. But in terms of large volumes, the porous media storage is probably the most cost-effective way. So we promised 3 slides here. So my third slide is to emphasize some of the pros and cons of that porous reservoir storage. It has basically unlimited capacity, and there's no penalty for long-term storage. Once you have it injected to the ground, the primary cost is the compression. Once it's in the subsurface, you can store it as long as you want, basically. So it's cost-effective for long-term storage. Compared to the other types of geologic storage, primarily the salt caverns, it has more geographic application. And why is that? The map in the lower right shows you the distribution of salt layers in green in the US, and the location of porous reservoirs, either depleted oil and gas in red or saline aquifers in blue. And you see that the green is primarily in the Gulf Coast area of Texas, Louisiana, and then some in Pennsylvania, for instance, but it's not widespread in the US. There's much more green and blue. That means we can apply a porous media storage geographically more widespread. And this is illustrated by the distribution of present-day natural gas storage, which uses the same technologies. The red is depleted oil and gas fields. It's 80% of all the natural gas storage sites, and the aquifers and the salt domes are 10% each. So those are more restricted geographically. So that's one of the downsides of geological subsurface storage. Is the geology dictates to some extent where you can do it. Another downside is perhaps that compared to a tank, you have the risk of losing some of the hydrogen that's stored by the hydrogen either diffusing or migrating away from your storage volume, and you cannot retrieve it again. There's also the risk to contaminate the hydrogen by some reactions that occur in the subsurface. And then we need to make sure that the cap rock does not fail. So with depleted oil and gas fields, we know that there's an intact cap rock, otherwise we would not have a hydrocarbon reservoir. But in those saline aquifers, we don't have this guarantee necessarily. But then there, for the oil and gas fields, there are, for instance, abandoned wells that could be leakage points. So there's a fair amount of thought and technology that has to go into this. And that's what geologists and petroleum engineers are concerned about. But I should mention that subsurface storage is widely used for natural gas in the US. About 14% of our natural gas supply is stored in the subsurface. And it's done overall fairly safely. So this is overall, the concept is not new. It's practiced. What is new is the storage of hydrogen in the subsurface in porous media. That is the frontier at the moment. With that, I give it over to my next panelist, Professor Delchad.
Thank you, Peter, for the great introduction. So as Peter mentioned, there are a lot of options for storing hydrogen either at surface or subsurface. But my focus here is looking at the potential of storing hydrogen in, for example, saline aquifers or depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So here, as Peter mentioned, and also Evan, hydrogen may contribute significantly by 2050 for energy transition and net zero goals. But one of the major challenges for implementing a full hydrogen economy is storage, as Peter mentioned. And for subsurface, subsurface is complicated, a lot of times maybe even unknown. So we need to have a clear understanding of fluid dynamics, containment security, deliverability rates, and storage capacity. And despite the vast experiences from industry in gas storage in subsurface, hydrogen has very different properties, much lower density and viscosity compared to other gases that we're used to, for example, CO2 or natural gas. So that requires additional research and development. Then on the right-hand side, I try to list some of the requirements, high-level requirements for storing hydrogen. And the first one is actually when you inject hydrogen in subsurface, you want it to stay in a confined volume. So then you'll be able to produce it back with a minimal loss and high rates. You need to have minimal losses due to the leakage through wells, cap rock, some complexity in the subsurface fractures, faults, and so on. Purity of hydrogen is critical. So when you choose a site, you need to be careful about what is the end use with respect to the purity. And also the proximity of the site close to where you're generating hydrogen. The cartoon that I have is similar to what Peter showed, giving you an indication of how the subsurface looks like. And unfortunately, I cannot use a pointer, but the blue is an aquifer, a deeper aquifer, and the pink color is a gas cap that where you're basically storing a lot of gas there. And on top of it is an impermeable rock that contains the gas in subsurface. You may also have higher aquifers, at the shallower depth as well. So what you can do, the options would be drill a well, inject and extract from the shallow aquifer, or you may want to inject and extract from the gas cap or the deeper aquifer, depending on the properties of these layers. Sorry for the resolution, is got a little bit out of zoom here. So I'm trying to highlight some of the key factors when we're dealing with subsurface hydrogen storage. As Peter mentioned again, reservoir characterization, I think, is the most critical aspect of subsurface storage of hydrogen. The properties of the reservoirs that you choose, some of the complex features like faults, fractures, gas cap, aquifer, and integrity of the cap rock. Fluid properties, they're critical. We need to have them as a function of pressure and temperature, and for example, solubility of hydrogen in brine is also a function of salinity of the water. It's going to be a multi-phase flow problem. So you may have 2 or 3 phases flowing simultaneously. So you need to be aware of petrophysical properties like relative permeability, capillary pressure, and so on. There will be a lot of operational questions and strategies. For example, is this going to be used as a long-term or a seasonal, weekly, monthly extraction injection? So you may have different strategies depending on the long-term versus short-term storage. A lot of questions regarding the number of wells, location of the wells, the rates that you inject and extract, the choice of cushion gas, and also more complex issues. For example, the reactivity of the hydrogen with the rock and other fluids in the subsurface that may generate new minerals or dissolve the existing minerals, and that will impact your properties of the subsurface. Biochemical reactions that may have some byproducts, and we need to be aware of those. And geomechanics, making sure that we're not going to have hydraulically fractured wells due to the injection and extractions of the large volumes. So this is one example of the type of work that we do, modeling and simulation of the subsurface when we're storing hydrogen. And this is one example of storing hydrogen in saline aquifer and looking at sensitivity to well operations. For example, there is just one, if you look at the image on the left-hand side, there is one injector that is going to be also used as extracting hydrogen. And then in a sensitivity study, we added more wells to pump the water and increase the capacity for hydrogen. We looked at the sensitivity on the top left table. Where we want to inject or extract should be over the entire pay, or should we just do it from the bottom layers. The images on the right hand side, there is basically the model and the saturation of hydrogen in green, and blue is the water saturation, showing you that most of the hydrogen migrated to the top of the formation. And when we added, so if you look at the last image on the right hand side, when we added more wells, we were able to increase the capacity, and as a result also be able to produce more volumes of hydrogen. So these types of modeling and simulation, they give us quite a bit of insight into how we can predict and also optimize the performance of storage sites, and also provide information for doing economics for a specific project. So with that, I'm going to let Kevin take over.
Thank you. Again, my name is Kevin Harris. I'm the Director of Sales and Business Development at Hexagon Porous. And today I'm going to talk to you about compressed hydrogen gas technology, specifically pressure vessels. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about our company. Porous is a subsidiary of a company called Hexagon Composites, which is out of Norway. About 300 million in revenue, about 1,000 employees. We have hundreds of thousands of Type 4 cylinders in the field, tens of thousands of vehicle fuel systems, which are comprised of those cylinders. And then we have distribution systems, also known as tube trailers, 1,500 of those approximately. And then on the lower pressure side, we have almost 20 million propane cylinders used for residential barbecues around the world, forklift applications, and so on. Next slide, please. This is what we're involved in. Battery electrics is something that we do in terms of battery modules, but we won't talk about that today. We'll concentrate on hydrogen. We do individual pressure vessels, we do systems, and we do distribution systems as well. Next slide. So short tutorial here on pressure vessels. There's basically 4 types. Type 1 is your traditional steel vessel, one you might find in lots of petrochemical plants, refineries, and so on. Type 2 is the same type of tank, except that it has a wrap around the hoop, allowing you to go with a thinner material in the cylindrical part of the cylinder. Type 3 is a fully wrapped cylinder, and the wrap typically is carbon fiber. And in a Type 3 cylinder, we're talking about a metal liner, which in the field of hydrogen is typically aluminum. And then Type 4, which is a technology that we're involved with, is also a fully wrapped cylinder, but with a non-metallic liner, which is indeed plastic. Next slide. So the Type 4 pressure vessels, why we're very interested in it, and our customers, is primarily it's lightweight. So automotive and transportation companies really like our tanks, or the technology of Type 4, because it is lightweight, allows more payload for passengers and items in the trunk, and hauling capacity, and so on. Very good at high pressures, upwards of 15,000 psig. Tons of cycle life, doesn't really suffer the same fatigue wear as metal tanks. And then we don't have any corroding parts, so we're also corrosion proof. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just show you, the shapes and sizes of these cylinders. You can see we range from, a few feet to over 50 feet in length, diameters from a few inches to a few feet, different pressures. At the top, we have 250 bar pressure vessel, which are mostly used in distribution, but also in some marine applications, a 350 bar, which is typically used in buses, 500 for ground storage and also transport applications, 700 bar in light duty and heavy duty vehicles, and then 950 bar used in transport and also ground storage as well. Next slide, please. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. These are some of the applications which pressure vessels find themselves in, basically into 3 buckets. The first bucket being onboard storage. So a lot of vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, passenger ferries, trains, but also adjacent markets such as mining equipment, agriculture, and a fair bit of aerospace as well. The next bucket would be stationary. So pressure vessels find themselves at hydrogen refueling stations. We have a bunch in Europe, in Canada, and the United States. And then lastly, distribution. So cylinders that are used to move hydrogen from the point of production to the point of consumption, a hydrogen fueling station, for example. Next slide. So today I know we're talking more about bulk hydrogen storage. So on the pressure vessel side, at least what we have to offer are these what we call multi-element gas containers that contain multiple cylinders in a container that are typically used to move hydrogen. But as they do in the CNG industry, these can also be used as pseudo-stationary, which can be just parked basically at the site of consumption and then depleted down and then replaced with a new container as you need the hydrogen. Also conceivably, and obviously with some permitting that would have to happen, these containers could be stacked one on top of each other, much like you see containers on a cargo ship. This particular picture here shows some of the product we have in Europe, different range of sizes in terms of lengths, different pressures, leading to different amounts of payload. Next slide, please. And then in North America, we also have something similar, pressures ranging from 250 bar upwards to 517 bar to 950 bar. And again, these are used for transport, but they can also be used in pseudo-stationary for bulk storage. That was my last slide that I wanted to show, but I just wanted to also let the audience know kind of what's happening here in the United States in terms of hydrogen. In California, there's already about 45 refueling stations out there. There's over 10,000 fuel cell vehicles. Lots of compressed hydrogen, and as you'll hear from Reid, liquid hydrogen moving around. And we will obviously need cavern or geologic storage because with intermittent power sources, we need to save up on hydrogen made from renewable energy. We need a place to store all that, and that storage isn't necessarily day to day. It's week to week or even season to season, and that's where the geological will come in. So I'll end my my talk there. Other than one more thing, I just wanted to add is, thank University of Texas. University of Texas is really a leader in the field of hydrogen, and I'm very happy to be part of this panel. So thank you very much, and on to Reid, our next speaker.
All right, great. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, UT as well, for putting on the event. I'm definitely excited as well to be part of this, and particularly being part of a diverse panel like this, because with this growing hydrogen economy, we need all the various solutions for the various aspects within the whole supply chain here for the hydrogen economy. So I'm the director of hydrogen sales here for the Americas at Chart Industries. If we go to the next slide. At Chart, we are the global leaders in liquid hydrogen tanks. So, as Kevin was talking about the gaseous storage, high pressure storage, we focus on the liquid storage, liquid cryogenic storage of hydrogen. So, these are some various tanks that you see here. It's a long history of these style of tanks. We go back over 55 years now, building cryogenic storage tanks, starting with the aerospace applications, and has quickly expanded from there. Think liquid hydrogen on board rockets, right? And moved from there to various industrial applications, as well as now more recently, of course, all the energy applications, as Kevin mentioned, the fuel stations. The majority of the hydrogen comes from and is transported on a liquid basis, utilizing the additional density benefits of liquid hydrogen. So a lot of these tanks are out there today. A lot are being produced, and it grows. Various sizes of these tanks, from just a few thousand or 100 gallons on up to a few 100,000 gallons in storage. And these are really just the shop-built tanks I'm talking about here. If there's a lot of additional storage needed, talking into the millions of gallons, and of course there's no cavern available at the site or geologic formation, there are site-built spheres that can be erected as well. These tanks are, of course, holding a cryogenic liquid, so this isn't very long-term storage, but utilizing some of the insulation technologies that we have, can definitely maintain the cold and liquid within these storage tanks for a good period here. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just showing a little bit more on how the tanks and how Chart sees the market here with our products. Hydrogen is produced. It is going to be compressed or liquefied for transport. So liquefaction, of course, would be our focus here when we're creating liquid hydrogen. Those plants have large scale storage at them. So typically in the realm of 60, 90, over 100,000 gallons of storage, either multiple shop-built tanks, like the previous slide, or the single spheres. From there, when it goes to distribution, of course, there's the gaseous distribution option, but as well there's liquid distribution, typically about 4,000 kilograms worth, or 18,000 gallons of storage on board each trailer. And those trailers today go coast to coast throughout the U.S., throughout Canada. They're also being used in Europe, and we're seeing more as well in need for Korea and China as those markets grow quickly as well. Other modes of transport will include ISO containers, rail cars, marine transport, of course, for the future, and all can be done with liquid hydrogen. When it comes to end uses, those are usually the smaller type of cryogenic tanks that we would build, the few thousand gallons sort of style, that then would supply and store the fuel for the fuel stations, for electricity backup generation, for refining, electronics manufacturing, all various end uses that either have existed or are growing today, and into the various applications that you see on the far right of the screen. Next slide, please. A little bit more about the tanks themselves. We're talking about shop built. So within our facilities here, I'm based in Minnesota. In our New Prague factory, we manufacture majority of the tanks. We're talking about, people call them bullets as well because of the shape, a large pill-shaped piece of equipment there. Standard sizes, custom sizes, I mentioned the various typical gallon ranges that you'd see here, which is about 1,000 kilograms on up to about 100,000 kilograms of size. The largest we've built to date would be about 50 tons, or 50,000 kilograms today. Next slide, please. A little bit about the insulation of these tanks, because of course liquid hydrogen is very cold, minus 420 degrees Fahrenheit. So need a very high quality and high level of insulation on these tanks in order to keep that keep the heat out. So there are a couple different ways of insulating the tanks. What we're talking with for liquid hydrogen is primarily a super insulation, as we call it, or more generically called a multi-layer insulation, MLI, which is some of these levels here of paper and foil insulation, as well as vacuum within an annular space that's created between the inner vessel that holds the liquid hydrogen and the outer vacuum jacket that holds in that vacuum. So it's actually 2 layers within each tank. Next level, or next slide, please. The plumbing comes mounted to these tanks, so ease of install, is important, particularly for the industry, where these tanks are being deployed quickly. So these tanks are engineered and built with all this plumbing you see here in the factory, and then will be shipped out to the various sites for install. Okay, next slide. Lastly, another important piece of consideration for these tanks is shipping. Of course, the larger volumes get quite large in overall size. So if we're talking the larger tanks for, say, liquefiers, for storing the larger volumes, it needs to be moved from the factory to the site of use. This could be over the road, like you see in these couple photos here. The trailer is just manufactured or made out of the tank itself for the move. That's pretty standard. But outside of that, certain tanks can be moved over the rail. The very, very large tanks are moved over the water, which is kind of a fun thing to see as well. But obviously limitations as far as where those tanks can go. So when you get very large, and that's where it gets into the site-built category, if you need to store the liquid hydrogen there, which is a little bit more of an involved process. A lot more is done at the site. Obviously, things are modularized a bit here and there, so they can do as much work as possible in the shop. But still, it's a multi-year process typically to get those large storage tanks built. But in the end, these tanks are very reliable, have a long history, have great performance, where you can put the liquid hydrogen in there, store it for a period of time, and pull it out for the various applications when needed. So, all right, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Reed, and to all the panelists. So there are some questions coming in. Please continue to submit those, and thanks for the questions thus far. So, I always think it's exciting to compare the subsurface and surface technologies just from a presentation perspective, where the subsurface always shows these wonderful geological diagrams, and then the surface people get to show all of these cool end-use applications, these planes, these trains, these automobiles. So could maybe the panel please speak to those in considering those end-use applications? Can the panel please speak to H2 storage needs across these applications? I know we've touched on scale, timing. What are the near-term opportunities? What are the longer opportunities? Maybe we'll start at the surface. So you've presented several market opportunities. What are your core competencies now? And then 5-10 years out, could you speak to growing those markets again, please? Maybe Kevin, start with you.
Let me unmute myself. Okay. Yeah, basically, as I mentioned, our claim to fame is in our lightweightness. So it is going to be things that move. So cars, trucks, buses, like I said before, but also on the distribution side. That's really where we are shining. We're currently in those applications. I can see us continuing to go there. And I think, there will be, depending on the how the application is used as well, will tell us what technology. So if hydrogen has to be stored for long periods of time without use, compressed hydrogen has its benefits. If you're talking about large quantities of hydrogen that are being used constantly, liquid hydrogen is gonna have its place there as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Reed. Anything to add from the surface perspective?
No, definitely agree with Kevin's comments there. And yeah, liquid makes sense with the density benefits when you need to move and store large amounts of liquid or of hydrogen. Of course, there is that investment up front to liquefy the hydrogen. So if you're moving at longer distances, what we're seeing right now within the market is the relative lack of supply and high demand is driving movement of hydrogen longer distances than we've seen in the past. So a lot of trailers moving long, cross country in getting to the various end uses. Of course, California has been a huge driver of the demand with the fueling stations coming online. I see a big mode change happening here within the next couple of years, the next few years, probably more likely, when heavy duty trucks start coming up on the roads. They're going to use a lot more hydrogen with, of course, the amount of fuel required, the number of miles that those heavy duty trucks require. So I'm very much expecting to see a big change in both the demand and the supply profiles over the next few years as more of that demand comes in, more of that supply comes online. It's going to be very much centralized production, large scale production, from electrolyzer plants, larger solar plants feeding the electrolyzers, and wind as well in the Midwest. And then that hydrogen being trucked around, eventually maybe railed around as well to all the different applications. Forklifts worth mentioning as well. That's been a huge growth on the demand side within the past couple of years.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I know the folks at HFTO have done, the Hydrogen Fuel Cells Technology Office have done a lot of work to ensure those forklifts, that market has grown. How about Peter and Mojda? You described the bulk storage scale of the subsurface, power generation, ensuring reliability of fuels. What perspective does the subsurface contrast?
So the technology that's available today, that is salt cavern storage. It's, if I can show one of my slides here, one of my backup slides, Kyla. It's practiced at 3 locations in Texas, along the Gulf Coast. Those are the 3 yellow stars on the slide here. This is Texas, here in Louisiana. But you also see in blue salt domes that are suitable for salt cavern storage, and in red are natural gas storage sites in salt caverns. So it's widely utilized today for for gas. And the low-hanging fruit is either converting some of those natural gas storage caverns for hydrogen, or to build new caverns in some of those other existing salt domes. So that is the technology that is proven, and it's practiced today. And actually, the state of Mississippi is in the process of building a new facility that would be about 10 times larger than what's currently being stored in Texas. So that is moving forward. The porous media storage is, there's more work to be done to move in that direction. And as I said, for natural gas, it is practiced widely for 100 years. But we still need to, the devil is in the detail. How does the hydrogen react in the subsurface? As Mojda already emphasized, there are engineering questions, there are geoscience questions that need to be addressed in terms of cap rock integrity. There's more work to be done. But again, this is, I would say, detail, that is all within reach within the next 2 years. Ultimately, I think it's a low technology development risk if we go in that direction, because we know it can be done for natural gas. I don't see any reason it cannot be done for hydrogen. But Mojda, maybe you have a different perspective on that.
Well, I just what I like to add is it really depends on the volume of hydrogen that we're going to produce and generate. And I believe that if it's going to be massive volumes in the future, which I'm optimistic that will be the case, then we need a portfolio of storage, surface and subsurface. And currently, there is a project that is going to happen in Mississippi. I believe that is going to start with a smaller scale, like salt cavern, and then gradually is going to go into saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So it's all a function of the volume that we're going to generate and how long we want to keep the storage, and the cost. Eventually, liquefying the hydrogen is going to be expensive. So we have to look at the cost as well and make a comparison of different options.
Thank you all. And Moja, that's a great segue. So when we think of cost, producing hydrogen is expensive, transporting is expensive, storing it is expensive. Let's maybe talk about recoverability from the subsurface side and storage permanence on the surface side. We've done all of this work. We have 100% hydrogen going into our system. What can we sort of expect to get out of these? Let's start on the subsurface in terms of recoverability.
Peter, you want me to comment?
Why don't you start and then I may add to it.
Yeah, some of the work, again, these are all based on numerical simulations of the site, but putting very realistic information into the numerical models. It all depends how you want to optimize the process, but it can be anywhere from 30% initially, but eventually is going to maybe get up to 90% recovery of hydrogen if you're willing to use some of the existing wells in a natural gas, for example, storage, that they already have the infrastructure in place, they have the wells. So put them online and add more extraction wells. You can get up to 90% recovery, but it can be as low as 30%. So it all depends on the operations.
And another concern is that, especially with porous media storage, that some of the hydrogen gets converted in something else. So one concern is that microbes may turn into methane, which if you burn it in a power plant in a turbine, it may not be a big issue. But if you want to maintain the purity of the hydrogen, that would be obviously a loss, right? The other one is production of hydrogen sulfide, also by microbes. H2S is commonly encountered in oil and gas operations, so the industry knows how to deal with it, but it's poisonous. It adds cost. If it needs to be dealt with, it adds cost, right? And the third one is actually the production of acetate, acetic acid or vinegar, not what you want, right? So there are chemical reactions that need to be thought about and how it affects the purity of the hydrogen.
Thanks. And maybe from the surface perspective, either from the materials side, we know hydrogen is a small reactive molecule. We put it into a system. Where does it go?
I guess I'll start on that one. It's fairly simple with the type 4 vessels. So the plastic liner is used to prevent permeation. So, but there is a little bit of permeation, but what we're talking about is like a few percentage points of loss per year when the pressure vessel's at full pressure. So, essentially you're not going to get any loss with the compressed gas vessel.
Yeah, same on the liquid side. Stainless steel construction, fully welded. No bellows sealed valves with soft, 100% seats. So no leakage within the vessel itself. Typically on the liquid side, people talk and have more concerns on long-term storage and permanence with heat, right, that comes in and vaporization of the liquid. So what we typically say along those lines is, of course, we work with our customers, our partners, to ensure that the design of the system, the amount of insulation and the size of storage matches the actual usage, right? If you're only storing hydrogen and not using it, typically you have a greater issue, at least for our applications, right? Lack of customers, lack of business, that sort of thing. So a balanced system is very important there, and if it's balanced, then there is no loss throughout that process.
Thank you. And maybe we can expand on this in the surface perspective. We have a question coming in. How much energy does it take to main H2 as a liquid and avoid liquid reverting to a gas? And again, maybe you were just touching it with the boil off, but we do a lot of work to compress these liquids. What sort of energy penalties are across those systems?
Yeah, I could take this one then from the liquid storage perspective. There is no energy required to keep it as a liquid. Of course, there's energy inputted initially, right, to get it to a liquid, but then the whole supply chain pathway is designed to allow for heat to slowly make its way in over the days or the weeks of storage and transport and end use. So there is no active refrigeration systems, anything that requires energy to put into the liquid storage. I'd say I think there's probably one exception of one tank at a NASA site that I'm aware of, where they just want to be able to maintain liquid hydrogen for essentially indefinitely. Which, in order to do so, they had a very small scale liquefier that they added to that site. So that would not be typical.
Yeah, and if there's expertise in hydrogen storage, certainly NASA has it. But anecdotally, I've heard for every molecule of hydrogen that NASA has purchased, they've lost half of it. So there are some storage challenges. How about maybe to Kevin? There's a question on sort of transportation, perhaps. So when do trailers make sense versus potentially pipeline transport? What sort of volumes may be considered there?
Yeah, I don't know the exact crossover point, but we're talking about probably hundreds of thousands of kilograms being used per day. On the gaseous side, we're talking of upwards of 1,000 kilograms per trailer, and so thousands of kilograms per day is probably where we make a lot of sense. And I think pipeline is it's not just a cost issue; it's also a timing. There's a lot of permitting that's involved. So even if you wanted to start today, you might not get a pipeline in the ground for another 5 to 10 years or so. So you really got to ask yourself, what's the urgency? What can we get done now? And then move forward with that. And then as hydrogen demand grows, which we all want it to do, then we'll eventually cross over into the pipeline area.
Thank you for that. Maybe on the surface side, again, when we think of the cost that goes into producing and transporting hydrogen, co-location of storage and consumption is critical. I know you've both spoken to the Gulf Coast in terms of geology and geography. It's inconsistent across the United States. If we think of, beyond saline aquifers, maybe hard rock caverns, is there an opportunity there in the subsurface? Or is it, and again, maybe if we think of demand and end use against seasonality and energy reliability, is there an opportunity in hard rock caverns for bulk hydrogen storage?
There is one site under construction in Sweden for a lime cavern, and that's the only project that I'm aware of. So it is, I would consider this a niche application. But again, the geology dictates where you can do subsurface storage, and in parts of the country where you just have basement rock, hard rock that's not porous enough, that may be the way to go. And building a cavern, especially in a softer rock type, it's easily done, right? Think about subway tunnel construction, right? So you still need a liner though, as far as I know, and that adds to the cost, a steel liner, for instance. So you rely on the rock formation to provide the pressure containment, but not necessarily on the leakage containment. So there's still a line involved. So that it's in between surface storage and subsurface storage, right? In terms of what's involved in building it. But yes, it's considered in certain geographic areas. But in terms of cost competitiveness, it would be rather expensive, as far as I know.
Thank you. So we only have a few 5 minutes left. So let's maybe try to end on an inspirational note, with so many challenges going on in the world. I think the hydrogen space, from, a young scientist perspective, well, science is cyclical, right? There have been investments in hydrogen in the past, but, basically feedstock costs are so historically low, and then renewable generation has come online to such a great extent that, from a cost competitive perspective, hydrogen may be within the realm of possibility. And obviously it has decarbonization advantages that really weren't considered in the past. So, sort of what all inspires you right now in the hydrogen space? What sort of opportunities are for the next generation of scientists? When I was in school, we were talking about basically peak oil consumption. and running out of energy resources. And then, hydraulic fracturing technologies came online, changed the game in the United States. So what excites the panel? And again, when we think of scientists moving out into the field, job opportunities, novel science, bulk hydrogen at scale, what comes to mind here? If anyone wants to jump in, I welcome it. But let's see. Reed, you look like you've got something. What excites you?
Oh, there's no end of excitement right now within the hydrogen space, particularly at Chart. We're from a young scientist perspective. First thing to say is we're hiring, right, and need all sorts of bright scientists and engineers to push our new technologies, our new products for all these various applications that are going out there. I mentioned heavy duty trucking recently, and that's just such a mode change, I think, for the transportation market when it comes to hydrogen. I think we're going to see a huge shift in the coming few years as those trucks start rolling out on the road, and the amount of infrastructure needed, the amount of hydrogen production, the amount of technologies needed. We're working on fueling stations to fuel the trucks, right? Which is starting at liquid hydrogen and having to generate high pressure hydrogen to fuel the onboard tanks, and that requires new pumps and new heat exchangers and new means of getting these new applications fueled and on the road, and at the same time working on onboard tanks for liquid hydrogen. So there's definite challenges ahead of us, but I see a lot of opportunity, and the excitement's there because the market's there, the market's real. I always talk about the forklift market, and people like to say how hydrogen might be economical in the future, if this or this or this or that happens. Today, hydrogen is the economic choice for forklifts. It's the cheapest option when you take into account OpEx and CapEx, everything, or TCO for the owners of the warehouses that are running the forklifts today. So that's very exciting to me.
Yeah, thank you. Challenges and great opportunity. Kevin, anything from the surface side, and then we'll go to the subsurface.
Well, yeah, I'm in agreement. It's a very, very exciting time right now. I've been involved with hydrogen since 2001. So it's great to see now the lower cost of renewable energy, a more developed supply chain, more developed codes and standards. By the way, we need more work there, more harmonization. But yeah, it certainly is. It seems like it's a time where things are coming together. The U.S. government now throwing $9.5 billion towards the hydrogen industry to make hubs and to make electrolyzers more cost effective. That's a huge deal. So we're definitely moving forward, and yeah, we need more ways to reduce costs. We need carbon fiber prices to come down. We need more engineers, more project management people to move this thing forward. But it's very exciting at this point in time.
Definitely, thank you. And from the subsurface perspective, you educate young minds. How do you all feel?
Well, do you mind, Peter, if I?
Go ahead.
Yes, so I'm very excited and I'm really passionate about this area because I'm in petroleum and geosystems engineering department. So there was a time when the price of oil was negative that I saw our students, they're very, very pessimistic about the industry. And even that time I told them, I said, you can apply your petroleum engineering, subsurface production, geology to other areas. And when I saw the opportunity with hydrogen, I said, here we go. You can apply this. You're going to be the future labor for this technology, and you're going to contribute to decarbonization. You're going to be part of this energy transition era. So I'm excited. They're excited. So I think we have bright future.
And I would make a more general comment. We need a resilient supply of energy. And we have experienced last year in Texas almost collapse of the grid, which told us that we cannot rely on just one form of energy source. We see it right now in Europe with the skyrocketing natural gas prices. We need a diversity in the supply of energy, right, to provide resiliency. And hydrogen, in addition to geothermal, for instance, in addition to wind and solar, of course, is one way to provide resiliency and a diverse energy portfolio. So I think it is, in some ways, a necessity that we explore this further and we go in this direction. And it's geothermal has huge challenges to bring it, to upscale it to the scale where we need it. Hydrogen is much more, in my view, and working on both actually, is much more within reach to replace natural gas and hydrocarbons as a dominant energy carrier.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you to all the panelists in UT Energy Week for convening us here today. Innovation is required, and let's get it done. So I think I'm going back to David, but thank you again for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.
Yeah, thank you for that excellent panel. Thanks to the panelist and moderator for that. And before that, we had an excellent keynote from John Berger of Sonova Energy International. So we're going to have a 15-minute break, come back at 11, and then we'll have our next panel on hydrogen generation and distribution.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our panel on hydrogen generation and distribution. This should be an exciting panel where we're going to talk about some of the technology and research and development that needs to be done to achieve good distributed hydrogen generation and distribution. There are a lot of similarities between hydrogen distribution and conventional hydrocarbon distribution, but there's actually some differences as well. And we're going to discuss some of those today and what needs to be done to realize a fully distributed hydrogen economy for energy resources. So I would like to start by introducing myself. My name is Hugh Daigle. I'm an associate professor in the Hildebrand Department of Petroleum and Geosystems Engineering here at the University of Texas at Austin. And now I'm going to introduce the panelists that we will have today for our session. So first we have Professor Joaquin Rosasco, who is an assistant professor in the McKetta Department of Chemical Engineering here at UT. Joaquin has a bachelor's in chemical engineering from the University of Oklahoma and a PhD in chemical engineering from UC Berkeley. He's worked on electrochemical CO2 reduction for his PhD and did a postdoc looking at developing relationships between the dynamic structure of atomically dispersed catalysts and the reactivity. And right now he's working on improved catalysts. And so he was recently selected to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in science. So we're very excited to have Joaquin here with us. Next up, we have Dr. Lorena Moscardelli, who is a research scientist here at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas. Lorena has a degree in geological engineering from Central University of Venezuela and a PhD in geological sciences from the University of Texas. She has worked in the oil and gas industry for PDVSA and more recently as a principal researcher at Equinor before rejoining the university here in 2021. Right now, she is the leader of the State of Texas Advanced Resource Recovery Program, also known as STAR. And her work is aimed at understanding the role of geoscience research as part of the ongoing energy transition while contributing to STAR's mission of conducting geological research to increase production and profitability of energy resources in the state of Texas. Next up, we have Professor Edward Yu, who is a professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering here at the University of Texas. Professor Yu holds a bachelor's and master's in physics from Harvard University and a PhD in applied physics from Caltech. He's won a number of awards, including an NSF Career Award, an ONR Young Investigator Award, and currently serves as a member of the DARPA Defense Sciences Research Council. And he's going to talk to us about some of his work on hydrogen. And finally, we have Kathy Ayers, who is the Vice President of Research and Development at Nel Hydrogen. And Dr. Ayers has a PhD in chemistry from Caltech and has worked for a while in the battery industry before joining Nel back in 2007. The team that she oversees is primarily responsible for stack activities in Nel, which span product development process from fundamentals to implementations. She's served in multiple scientific advisory roles, 2 federal level advisory committees, and was awarded the American Chemical Society Women Chemists Committee 2014 Rising Stars Award. She is currently a fellow of the Electrochemical Society. So I would like to start off by having our panelists give a short introduction to offer some of their perspectives on hydrogen. And let's see, I guess we can start with Joaquin, if you would like to lead off. Good.
Sure. Yeah. So my research interests really are on catalysis and electrocatalysis. So I'll focus on that part primarily, but probably the practical application of these electrochemical processes for forming hydrogen, Kathy will probably expand on quite a bit. So the goal here is to use electrochemical processes like water splitting as a form of energy storage for intermittent renewables like wind and solar. So you basically use that energy to drive chemical reactions like splitting water or CO2 reduction to form an energy dense fuel like hydrogen. So this is in a sense mimicking what nature does in photosynthesis of taking energy from the sun to drive chemical reactions. So nature is quite efficient in its catalytic processes for running these reactions. And I would argue that one of the biggest bottlenecks to applying these processes is to find efficient catalysts that convert, say, water into hydrogen and oxygen. So to demonstrate that, here I have some information about development of catalysts for the two electrochemical half reactions, the reduction of protons to form hydrogen and the oxidation of water to form oxygen. So for a long time, we've known that platinum is a wonderful catalyst for doing the reduction reaction. So it requires essentially no additional potential from the thermodynamic potential to run the reaction. But of course, it's quite expensive. So we'd like to replace it with an earth abundant analog. So what I have here is on the left side, the y-axis here is how much potential we need to apply to get these earth abundant catalysts to drive an appreciable rate of hydrogen evolution. And we've made quite some advances in terms of making earth abundant sulfide based or phosphide based catalysts that approach the reactivity of platinum on this metric. But over here on the right, what you can see is that the intrinsic activity, so how quickly one of these catalytic sites makes hydrogen, so how many molecules it makes per second, is still roughly 4 orders of magnitude lower than platinum. So there's quite a lot of room to improve the catalyst for running this reaction. So the picture is actually a little bit worse for the corresponding oxidation half reaction. So here you can see the required potential even for precious metals is quite a bit higher. So it's even higher than our earth abundant catalyst for hydrogen evolution. And additionally, all of the earth abundant materials based on things like nickel and iron are unstable and dissolve in acid. So really there's a huge impact that we could make by making earth abundant catalysts that we can use in more wider conditions. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with here is the sort of how I see catalysis playing into the hydrogen sort of ecosystem more broadly than just hydrogen generation electrochemically. So in addition to its role as an energy carrier, hydrogen is already used in very large scale in catalytic processes. One example being ammonia synthesis, the Haber-Bosch process. So basically combines nitrogen and hydrogen to form ammonia to make synthetic fertilizers. So this process alone, helps us feed about half the world's population based on what we could do with natural nitrogen sources alone. And it also accounts for about 1.4% of total CO2 emissions. So displacing some of that hydrogen that we're getting from steam reforming of methane could be a big win there. I'd also argue that catalysis even has a role in things like hydrogen distribution and storage. So we could think, for example, of instead of just transporting gaseous hydrogen, we could do hydrogenation reactions to liquid molecules. So here I have an example of toluene hydrogenation to methyl cyclohexane. So you could essentially transport a liquid fuel now, and then on site where you want to use your hydrogen, you can run the corresponding dehydrogenation reaction to get that hydrogen off. So again, this is a process that's limited by our ability to do the catalysis efficiently. And so there's quite a lot of work to be made or to be done there to make these processes more efficient. So yeah, looking forward to this discussion here.
Okay, thanks, Joaquin. Thanks for the introduction. Lorena, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you for the introduction and the invitation to the panel. One of the things that I wanted to highlight today was that when we talk about hydrogen generation and distribution, we also need to think about hydrogen storage. And, a little bit of context in terms of the scale is I think is important. If we were to replace 10% of natural gas, right now in the US, we would need around 1,000 BCF of hydrogen storage capacity. But right now we have roughly between 5 and 8 BCF. What that means is that we'll have to increase our current hydrogen storage capacity by a factor of 200. So there are ways to do this. We need to use the subsurface. We will need the subsurface for this. The first stop for this is the use of salt formations, which is a proven concept. There are 4 localities around the world, 3 of them located in the Gulf Coast in Texas, where we have hydrogen storage undergoing on salt domes that look like this. And there are some estimates, these are moving numbers, that at least for the Gulf Coast, if we use this kind of salt formations, it gives us a potential storage capacity between 2,500 to 3,500 BCF. But once again, keep in mind, if we want to replace natural gas by only 10% hydrogen, we will need 1,000 BCF capacity. So if we go 50%, 100%, you can imagine the challenge here. The second thing that I would like to say here is that, we talk about the hydrogen economy. I like to talk about the hydrogen ecosystem, which means from our perspective that you would need co-location of both surface and subsurface resources. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but on this image, we're just trying to illustrate how something like that would look like, for instance, in a Gulf Coast scenario. And hypothetically, you will need, your hydrogen storage in salt domes. But then if we're talking about blue hydrogen, for instance, we're also talking about CO2 sequestration, which means that you need feasible formations nearby where you can inject and sequester, the CO2. Again, if we're talking about blue hydrogen, we're talking about natural gas supply as well. So where are your gas fields, or where your supply is going to come from? Keeping in mind that cost will increase as these things are far away from each other. And then finally, a question that I have in my head is, we also will need a lot of water, being green hydrogen or blue hydrogen for the steam reforming process, as I understand it. So where are these resources coming from, and how we're going to handle this ecosystem? So thinking about that, one approach is to try to start to map resources. And here I'm just showing a draft map on the Gulf Coast region where we have active gas wells in red. And then we have, where the hydrogen plants are, where the potential salt domes are located, where the pipelines are, hydrogen pipelines versus CO2 pipelines, and so on. We can do the same thinking about hydrogen potential from wind. And here in the background, I'm showing, hydrogen potential generation in thousands of kilograms per square kilometer per year. And then same exercise, where is the relevant infrastructure that we need in here? So in short, I think, I just would like to end with this picture here, or this concept of the hydrogen ecosystem. It's just not one component, it's how all these components will play together. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Lorena. Very interesting. Ed, would you like to give us a brief introduction now?
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Hugh. So as Hugh mentioned, I'm a professor here at UT in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. I'm also the director of an NSF-sponsored Materials Research Science and Engineering Center. And my connection to the panel topic is that we have a number of projects going on in my lab that are directed towards looking at technologies for photoelectrochemical green hydrogen production. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the lower part of this slide, what's shown is what is currently the most widely employed method for hydrogen production, known as steam methane reforming. And the basic idea is that you take methane CH4, you combine it with water H2O, you heat them up, and what you get out is hydrogen and CO2. And for every kilogram of hydrogen that you get, you also get several kilograms of CO2, which most typically is released into the atmosphere in so-called gray hydrogen production. And then that's a significant issue for the climate and environment. In the upper part of the slide, what I've shown are the two main approaches that are being explored right now for green hydrogen production by splitting water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. So on the left is shown what's known as electrolysis, which can be combined with renewable, that is carbon-free energy sources. And so the idea would be that one could take electricity from, say, a solar panel and use it to power an electrolyzer system, essentially applying a voltage across a cathode to an anode that are separated from each other by an exchange membrane, and that allows from water the production of hydrogen at the cathode and oxygen at the anode. So of the two technologies shown here, this is kind of the more well-developed of these. The other shown in the upper right is what's known as photoelectrochemical water splitting. And the idea here is that one has a photoelectrode, or perhaps separately photocathode and photoanode. And the idea is that the photoelectrode absorbs sunlight, which results in the production of mobile charge carriers, electrons and holes. But then instead of extracting the electrons and holes as electricity, which is what happens in a solar cell, those electrons and holes participate directly in the chemical reactions that are required to produce hydrogen and oxygen from water. So oxygen gas at the anode and hydrogen gas at the cathode. And both of these approaches can allow for the production of hydrogen without CO2 emissions, so-called green hydrogen production. Next slide, please. Okay, what I've shown here are just some cost projections and also some historical cost data for electrolyzers and also for silicon photovoltaics. So on the left is some information from a 2020 report from the International Renewable Energy Agency showing their cost projections for green hydrogen production using electrolyzers. The upper curves kind of in brown are for a higher assumed price for electricity. The lower curves in green are for a lower assumed cost of electricity. And then the two different curves in each color tone are for different assumptions about cost of electrolyzers. And the main point here is that you can see that with the lower cost of electricity, then even in the relatively near future, it's projected that it should be possible for the electrolyzer approach, which was the one on the left in the previous slide, to sort of get into the range of costs for fossil fuel-based production of hydrogen. On the right, what I've shown is something that's sometimes referred to as Swanson's law. And this is, it pertains to silicon solar photovoltaics. And what it shows is that there has been a very dramatic decrease in the cost of solar photovoltaic modules. The axis on the vertical axis is dollars per watt for solar modules. And that cost has been driven largely by sort of an increase in the cumulative installed solar photovoltaic capacity. So essentially scaling in manufacturing and the associated learning and technology development. And that has brought the cost down to now well under 50 cents per watt. And I show this for a couple of reasons. One is to sort of illustrate the power of scaling in achieving very dramatic cost reductions. And the other is to remind us that this is really based on technology for silicon photovoltaic modules. That's the dominant technology for commercial photovoltaics. And so it's worth thinking about whether all of that learning and the established infrastructure could also be brought to bear on, say, the problem of photoelectrochemical water splitting for hydrogen production. Next slide, please. Okay, so then this is the last slide that I have, and it's just illustrating some of the work that we've been doing in this area in my lab over the last year or two. And what we've been able to do is to develop and apply manufacturing and fabrication approaches that allow for the creation of silicon-based photoelectrodes using only techniques that are very well established and low cost for semiconductor and other types of manufacturing. And the upshot of this is that these approaches allow for the creation of silicon-based photoelectrode structures like what's shown in the cartoon in the middle of the slide. So one can have silicon as the semiconductor absorber, which is desirable for low cost, a thick insulator layer that provides very good stability of the photoelectrode in the conditions under which the water splitting reactions occur. That's shown in the graph with the blue curve just above the diagram. And it also simultaneously allows for realization of very good performance at a level that we expect should be able to lead quite straightforwardly to, in a system, solar to hydrogen efficiencies that are at the level of 10% or greater, which is a significant benchmark in this field. And because of the scalability of these types of fabrication approaches that we have used, it's been possible for us to go over the past year from making a kind of square centimeter scale devices, which is fairly typical for research in this field, and in the photograph at the far left, to quite easily, even in our lab, wafer scale fabrication as shown in the right-hand set of photographs with a pretty straightforward path, we think, to scalability to larger sizes, multiple wafers, and so forth, and eventually the potential for cost structure that is comparable to that for silicon photovoltaics. So that's what I have. Thanks very much.
Okay, very good introduction, Ed. Thank you very much. So finally, Kathy, I'd like to invite you to give a brief introduction here.
Yep. So I just wanted to give people a little bit of scale perspective because I think often people aren't really aware of where electrolysis technology is. So if you want to go to the next slide, I just have some pictures of our factories. So we at Nel have commercial electrolyzers in both of the major technologies. We make alkaline electrolyzers where you're circulating a conductive fluid and you use basically a fabric separator to separate the two electrodes. Our factory for producing those is in Norway, and our Herøya plant can make about half a gigawatt per year now, and is scalable to 2 gigawatts a year, which is about 1,000 tons per day of hydrogen. Then we have the proton exchange membrane electrolysis technology, which Ed alluded to earlier, where you have a membrane separating the two electrodes. You're circulating pure water, and we fabricate that technology in Wallingford, Connecticut. And our current factory can do about 150 megawatts a year. And then we do also have a fueling station plant in Denmark, which I'm not really going to talk about today. So if we go to the next slide. I just want to also point out that I think a big conception is that electrolysis is too expensive of a technology for producing hydrogen, period. And while we still have a room that we need to take advantage of at the larger scale, there are hydrogen markets today where electrolyzers serve them quite well. And our markets have basically grown as our unit scale has increased. So you see going from kind of benchtop units for lab applications up to more industrial looking kind of industrial freezer size units for processes like metal heat treating and things like that, all the way up to megawatt scale now for vehicle fueling and other larger scale applications. And so the technology really has scaled quite a bit, and the cost has come down as we've done that. So just on the last two slides, I wanted to give people a little bit of scale, sense of scale for these products. So our factory in Norway is pictured here. You can see the two workers there next to the electrode tanks. That's where we're making electrodes, and the stack, which produces about a ton a day from this facility, that's produced in this facility, is approximately the same size as that tank. So these are very large electrolyzer systems. The stacks can be integrated together in a plant of basically any scale. And this plant is fully automated at this point, and we're actually having a grand opening of it soon. The other technology is on the next slide. And so you see the difference here between the size of the stack. So this is about a half a ton per day stack with the engineer standing next to the entire stack. And again, we can put these into systems of various sizes. So we're currently producing 1.5 and 1.25 and 2.5 megawatt containerized solutions. We've fielded several of those for different bus fueling applications. And we also have a 20 megawatt plant that's starting up in Spain, and we're looking to scale from there. So in terms of where we need to do some of that cost reduction, it's in the power electronics side, better leveraging of common industries to us, and designing the stack current and voltage to go along with that. Manufacturing investment so that we can get the cost of the parts down and improve our process capability. I think as Ed was mentioning, we currently use precious metals in the PEM products. And so we need to figure out how to minimize that, how to get thinner membranes and increase our material utilization. And finally, potentially going up to higher current densities. So the alkaline systems don't need so much precious metal, which is why they can be so much bigger and still be cost competitive. The PEM products do use them, but we're looking at ways to minimize the use of them and or go to non-precious metals if any of them get to the point where, I guess it was actually Joaquin was talking about catalysts, that we can make those as active and stable as the current catalysts. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much, Kathy. So these are all very interesting takes on this topic of hydrogen generation and distribution. And I'd like to kick off our panel discussion here just with a fairly broad question, fairly broad topic. So generating hydrogen requires some sort of an external energy input, right? Whether it be from the sun or conventional power like was used in a steam reforming system. And if you talk about getting that energy from some kind of renewable resource, you might have certain times of the year where that energy is more abundant. And so we talk about, seasonal generation, storage, and dispatch of hydrogen. And so can we talk a little bit about how that really works and what is the kind of technology debt that is out there that we need to overcome really to get to the desired reliability and solution that we're looking for? I think whoever wants to start off with that can jump in.
I'll start, I guess, and then I would think that Lorena might have something to say about that because I think storage is a big piece of that. Seasonal storage, hydrogen is very good for that because it can be stored without capacity fade, unlike batteries. I think the balance needs to be between what is the capacity factor of the equipment versus the amount you have to use it and the cost of the electricity that you're using to power them. Because if the usage of the equipment is too low, then those dollar per kilogram numbers are going to go way up. So we have to balance using them some period of time, but also producing enough excess that you can then have that excess for use in lower periods of storage. So it's there's a lot of work that needs to be done looking at modeling of how often are you going to run the electrolyzer and at what power prices is that going to give you, and then how does that feed back in?
Okay. Lorena, how about the storage perspective on that?
I think this is an interesting topic. And maybe, I might not have a good answer to that. The thing today is with at least blue hydrogen with steam methane reformers, these units are embedded on the refineries and they're used, already. So there is a carbon footprint to this, and you need energy to do this. In the future, if we're talking about, I think green hydrogen and facilities that are dedicated to that, I think the beginning of the operation is going to look very different than the end in terms of how the first, 5 years look like versus that threshold afterwards. Ideally, I would think that you would like to have these facilities in areas where you can store hydrogen so that at some point is a cycle where you can power the facilities with the hydrogen that you are storing as well. But the issue of curtailment is a big issue. Sometimes, when you are over-generating, is my understanding here, we're talking about millions of dollars that can be lost if there's no way to harness that energy and store it. So that's why the component of hydrogen storage is so important, but definitely it's a complex topic.
Absolutely. Now, what about the dispatch? So we talked, we think we understand how to make hydrogen and that it needs to be stored because a lot of the time you have excess generation capacity. How quickly or, how rapidly can we respond to changes in demand for power, using hydrogen? Is this something that you can take out on an hourly or daily scale, or is this really just more of a larger term seasonal resource?
I would say that the analyses that I've seen say actually hydrogen makes a lot of sense for energy storage once you're past kind of a 12 to 24 hour mark, so it doesn't need to be that seasonal. I would say that the other advantage of hydrogen, though, is that it's so dispatchable. So you're probably going to want batteries if your intent is just to take things off the grid and put things back on the grid, especially if it's short term. But if you're looking to sort of grow a hydrogen economy, you may not be putting that hydrogen that you made back into energy that goes back to electricity. You may be using it for fueling. You may be using it for chemical production. You may be using it for blending with natural gas to do heating. And so it really is, I think the term was used earlier, an ecosystem that we have to look at holistically.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And when you look at, thing like comparing Europe to Texas, Europe, they need a lot of energy during the winter for heating, whereas here we need some for heating and some for cooling during the summer. So it's very different how you're going to utilize and dispatch that.
But you need a lot in industry in Texas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You need a lot in industry, and obviously we're a very industry-heavy state in certain parts. So we have a question coming in from the audience, and this is about water purification. So maybe Ed, you can kick this off. So what is the constraint in terms of water purification for hydrogen production, and the energy requirements for purification and loss of water quality?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's a great question. And certainly at the research level, right, the testing that's done of, say, photoelectrodes in the field that we work in that's relevant to the panel, typically it's done under selected and controlled conditions, either, in some cases an alkaline solution, in some cases an acidic solution, or something else. And the water purity is generally pretty good. For larger scale implementation and use, that's something that may or may not be as practical. Perhaps one would like to go to neutral pH, be able to tolerate contaminants and such. And there's certainly work that is going on in the field generally to address these kinds of issues. Looking at operation under a wide range of pH levels with contaminants, including work on even things like operating with salt water, which would make it possible to operate, say, with ocean water and such. And I think the energy requirements, right, to the extent that purification is required, right, they could be significant. I think that's still an open question. And loss of water quantity, right, using water for this rather than something else is something that if one is talking about pure fresh water, right, that could be significant as well. If it's possible to develop technologies that can operate robustly and with long-term stability in, say, salt water or something like that, then perhaps it's less of an issue. So I think these are all questions that will need to be addressed in the field going forward and are being addressed in a number of cases right now.
Excellent. Joaquin, I want to get your perspective on this because I thought you had a really cool image in one of your slides about the performance of different catalysts at different pH levels. And so what are some of the things we can do with the catalysts that might be able to expand the range of pH and water purity to alleviate some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a concern. The performance of the catalyst changes dramatically in different conditions. The catalysts that you can use under different conditions change. So I pointed out, for example, in the two architectures that Kathy pointed out of, alkaline systems versus acidic systems, what catalysts are even stable under those conditions, what's available to you changes. In the PEM acidic systems, for the oxidation reaction, you just have one iridium oxide or ruthenium, both precious metals that are stable, and a lot of these nice earth abundant metals that work in alkaline conditions. are no longer available to you. But even, the same catalyst, if you run hydrogen evolution over a platinum catalyst and acid versus base, you get very different performance. And so I think that's an active area of research in catalysis, also of understanding of how you change the conditions that you test the catalyst in, how it affects reactivity. And hopefully that could inform, how the performance of the electrolyzer will change if you you use a different water feedstock or operate in different conditions.
Very good. So while we're on this topic, I want to interject a question that came to my mind, which is that generating hydrogen requires water, and in some cases a large amount of water. Now, Lorena, when you showed that map of solar and I think it was wind energy potential in Texas, a lot of the wind energy, obviously along the coast, you have access to seawater, which maybe we can't use so much right now. But then areas that farther in West Texas that have good wind energy potential do not have a lot of water, right? So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, in terms of this hydrogen ecosystem, where it might make sense to locate your generation facilities in terms of water requirements and how we can balance that against some of the existing water scarcity issues out there.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's the same question that I have, But one thing that I'm thinking, and it's interesting to hear Ed's comments on the research to use seawater for this. There is formation water, right? That is very deep. It's not the aquifers that are drinking water that are shallow. There are fluids in the subsurface where you have formation water that is essentially salty water with a whole lot of other minerals and things like that. And I think, I don't know if there is research on that, if that kind of water or chemistry could be used for these processes, but I think it's something that I'm curious to learn about, because that could be an alternative for places like West Texas.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and to the extent that seawater is difficult to deal with, some of those formation brines are pretty nasty. So there's definitely some technology development that could be needed there to help out with this water issue. Well, since we're on a roll here, I have another question. I want to kind of open this up to a bit of a roundtable. So can we just have a discussion to educate the audience a little bit on how hydrogen generation and storage technology has really progressed over the last decade or so, and where we see it going in the next, 5 to 10 years? Kathy, you might be a good person to start that off.
So as I showed in that one slide, the electrolyzer technology itself has scaled quite a bit in the last 10 years. I mean, when I started at Nell, I think our biggest unit was 40 kilowatts, and now we're producing, 20 megawatt plant. So along with that, obviously, we've made advancements in how we make certain components. But they're still pretty batch oriented, and there's still a lot of manual steps. So there's a lot we can do that's already been done in the fuel cell side to basically industrialize the manufacturing of components, at least for PEM. On alkaline, I would say that technology was largely pretty stagnant for a number of years. And now that it's been sort of reinvigorated, we've seen lots of areas where we can take advantage of advancements in catalysts, and same thing on automation and things like that. So we're actually finding a fairly large pathway for cost reduction there too, including increasing the current density, because fewer stacks means lower cost. So I think we're actually at a very good point to on the technology side to take advantage of what we see as that tipping point in terms of hydrogen demand.
Excellent. Ed, I want to call on you a little bit to give a comment on this as well. I really like your plot of Swanson's law for photovoltaics. How has the scalability really improved over the past 10 years?
Well, I would say right now there is a lot of research that is directed towards technologies that will ultimately show good potential for scalability in photoelectrochemical devices. But certainly more limited work on actually scaling to, very large devices, large total areas, and so forth. Part of that, I think there's been a lot of progress in this field generally over the last decade. Part of that has been in looking at the semiconductor absorber materials, right? So the materials where you absorb sunlight and create electrons and holes. Looking at materials that have good potential for low cost. I think earlier a lot of the emphasis was on getting high efficiency, but now there's also a lot of interest in getting to low cost materials that can be made easily, and then also depending on the energy band gaps of the materials, which determine both how effectively sunlight can be absorbed at different wavelengths and also what the energies of the resulting carriers are with respect to the redox potentials for the water splitting reaction. There's been quite interesting work on wider bandgap materials where you can have absorption in a single material and get both the reduction and oxidation reaction as well as the sort of the individual photocathode and photoanode materials. As Joaquin mentioned, and perhaps Joaquin can speak in more detail to this, there's a lot of interest, and it's a hugely important problem, developing catalysts that both perform well and also don't make use of precious metals to the extent that will be required for, because the scale to the extent that will be required will, is probably not feasible with very rare elements being the catalysts. I think from a research perspective, it's also been a very rich field because developing these kinds of technologies requires people with expertise in materials, in solid state device physics, in chemistry, liquid solid interfaces, and so forth, all really to come together and bring together very different ingredients, right, to really make progress in this area. But I think it's something that people have realized now is it's a very important and compelling application, and it's become very active over the last decade with people coming in from a variety of fields.
Excellent. So we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience, but before we go to those, Joaquin, I just want to can you give a brief comment on this?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess one sort of interesting development I've seen in terms of catalyst development is making use of insights from other areas that may be a little more mature. So some of the earth abundant catalysts that I mentioned come from, people saw analogies between the things you want your catalyst to do for hydrogen evolution and what hydrotreating catalysts do in reactions like hydrodesulfurization. And so people essentially adapted catalysts from those reactions. So the sulfides and phosphide catalysts that I mentioned are applied industrially for those reactions, and sort of can make use of insights from those chemistries for this new application.
Great, thank you. Okay, so here's a question from the audience about electrolyzers. So are any electrolyzers being developed that include electronics that enable the electrolyzer to operate using widely varying voltages and current levels, such as those directly using DC from solar panels? Kathy, that might be a good question for you to start.
Yeah, I would say today pretty much commercial electrolyzers are running off of rectifiers, so they're taking relatively clean power. I mean, they can respond pretty well to changes in input current, which is usually how they're controlled. But I do think we're looking much more closely at what's the best way to do that integration, whether it's direct DC from solar or whether it's AC from wind. What's the most efficient way to convert that power and use it to power the cell stacks? So I think, like I said, the stacks themselves can handle some of that, but the product development around those is still underway.
Speaking of product development, I'm going to go to the next question we have here, which is about can we offer projections on future capex and cost of large electrolyzer installations? So we're talking hundreds of megawatts, say, 4 years from now or in 2030 relative to what they are today. How do we think those are going to change?
I would say we have confidence that they can be decreased by at least 50% versus where they are today, probably even more, especially if you're talking about the scale as well. So, I would say independent analyses put megawatt-ish scale electrolyzers in the, say, $1,000 to $1,400 a kilowatt range, maybe a little bit less for alkaline. We really need to get below 500, and even, you know, the DOE targets, I think, are 300 in 2026. So I think in that sort of range, and then seeing how far we can drive below that going forward. Certainly, there are people now claiming that that those kind of numbers are possible, and our roadmaps would say that also.
What's driving that reduction in cost that you see?
On the balance of plant, it's really just kind of engineering scaling laws. So as the volumes scale, your sort of cost per volume of gas produced is lower. On the stack side, it's really what I was talking about before: the manufacturing, the reduction in uses of expensive materials, et cetera.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know you mentioned the concept of tipping points, but yeah, as we start using more and more hydrogen, I think you're going to see this scalability issue really, take the forefront in terms of driving down costs. So I think that's really interesting. Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about, and this maybe Joaquin, I'll start off with you on this. The issue of precious metals and critical minerals that might be used in catalysts that we look at. So obviously these there are some social and environmental costs that come with providing those materials. So what can we do to try to mitigate some of that, and in terms of how we design these catalysts?
I think the main bottleneck there is stability. I think if activity is more of the problem, then you can think about ways to use the catalyst more effectively, so that the amount of hydrogen you're producing per mass of precious metal is as high as that can be. But if the catalyst is just not going to be stable under the conditions that you run it, you're going to run into a problem. So there, I think, that's a big research challenge, is to identify non-precious metals that you can use in acidic environments. So I think those are the two keys: is catalyst discovery, to identify new materials that you could potentially use to replace precious metals, and then if we're using precious metals, to just use them as efficiently as we can. I think it's not a barrier that can't be overcome. I mean, platinum catalysts are used as in all kinds of catalytic reactions today. So it's not a sort of non-starter to use these precious metals, as long as they're being used effectively.
Mm-hmm. So while we're on the subject of electrodes and electrolyzers and stuff, here's a question from the audience. What type of architecture, we're talking 2-dimensional versus 3-dimensional, of electrodes is used for commercial alkaline electrolyzers? In the lab, apparently in the lab scale, 3-dimensional architecture is used. But Kathy, maybe I can kick that one to you.
I think it varies by company and by what types of things they're doing. I mean, there are systems that use more of a catalyst coating on a more planar substrate, and there are also ones that I think use a coated mesh. The chloralkali systems, I believe, use coated meshes too, those dimensionally stabilized anodes and things. So I think it just depends on kind of the legacy of a particular company, but both methods are feasible.
Excellent. Okay, we've got a really good question here. This should elicit some good discussion. Are university research projects for producing, storing, transporting, and consuming green hydrogen being adequately funded? And should commercial companies begin shifting more of their research and development funds to hydrogen? Any one of you can start and take that one.
Okay, maybe I'll start.
Go ahead.
And if you ask a university professor this kind of question, the answer is almost always going to be yes, more funding would be great.
Right.
In this case, I think that is, I would say it's actually objectively true, as in addition to being perhaps self-interestedly true. I think we are really at a point right now where there is tremendous potential for technological and scientific progress in this area, and funding is a driver both for research activity and also research interest in particular fields. And I think especially modes of funding that can bring together people who have very different kinds of expertise, I think is going to be very important in this area, right? I mentioned several areas that contribute even to just the, say, photoelectrode technology development and the ways in which you would use them. There was a question earlier about electronics and how that plays into all of this. And, certainly efficient electronics, ways of controlling and optimizing the way electricity is used or, for these kinds of applications is very important. And there's certainly precedent for that even in photovoltaics with technologies for inverters, which is an important part of kind of photovoltaics technology generally. And I think that it would also be very valuable for companies to perhaps shift some of their R&D efforts or partner with universities, because in many ways that is how technologies that are developed in universities can propagate most efficiently and be transferred most efficiently to effective commercial realizations. Each side, the company and the university, brings a lot to that, and it's largely complementary. Sorry for the siren here. I think that's the UT safety.
We'll pause for a minute.
Perfect timing, huh?
Okay, I think that's our monthly emergency system. You're not on campus. Lorena, I wanted to ask you to give your perspective. You're obviously the director of a large research program at the BEG. What can we do with more funding, and how can we direct that specifically for green hydrogen?
This is how I feel about that question. I don't know if you want to pause for a second. It should end.
Yeah, it should be done.
Yeah, but it was a good introduction to the answer. No, in terms of funding, it's a very interesting point. As a researcher, on the side of my current role, I think there are two components that I think Ed touched into. One, yes, the funding in terms of the money amount, but also the investment in terms of collaboration, because these problems are so complex and the magnitude and the scale of what we need to do is such that not one single entity, university or private industry or federal entity, will be able to provide answers in the time frames that we need. So that's my main concern. So the investment on collaboration in allowing and enabling people to work together and to share knowledge is going to be key. In terms of the funding per se, I think, the Bureau is a 100% soft money organization. So there are always challenges when it comes to that. So for sure, opportunities coming down the pipe in terms of federal funding, it's important. So we just need to see them, right? Where are they? And then my call, in terms of industry, the private sector, is that there is this push for the energy transition to advance at a very fast pace for very good reasons. And for us to make that happen, we need the funding. So any venues that can be as much as we interact with the public to talk about the urgency, we also need to interact with research organizations to interact with the funding so that we can make it happen. So yeah, I think that's my spin on that. Yeah.
Excellent. I just want to add my 2 cents. The bit about should commercial companies begin shifting more of their R&D funds to hydrogen. I think it's a great idea because, we know that hydrogen has tremendous potential for providing energy, especially for heavy industry and difficult to abate industries. And if you look at the energy transition as a whole, you're really going to need a lot of different solutions that work in different situations, and hydrogen will definitely be one of those. So, certainly I would encourage industry to start looking at that more. Okay, the next question we have is, Does anyone have a full energy chain conversion efficiency as the fraction of hydrogen fuel energy out to the energy input for the entire storage or production, storage, and distribution, and how that compares to gasoline today, which we use to power light vehicles? Anybody have any figures on that?
I don't have hard figures, but I would guess if anybody does, it would be DOE, the Fuel Cell Technologies Office, or now the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office. I do know that the fuel side of things, a fuel cell gets about twice the efficiency as combustion does, so that helps. But obviously, that doesn't account for all the work that goes into production, storage, and distribution.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yes, and I agree. DOE is probably a good resource for that.
Maybe I could just comment though on the last question as well. So,
oh, absolutely.
I totally agree that collaboration is essential, and I would say pretty much all of our funded R&D projects through DOE, et cetera, all have at least a university or a national lab, if not both, on them. So I think it is really important to both have, the industry reaching out to more fundamental groups to get that characterization, and also the industry groups to reach out to the university groups reaching out to industry to make sure that there's an outlet, or that the research is going towards the right requirements and things like that.
Excellent. Let's see here. I want to ask, maybe this would be a good question for Lorena. So, you deal a lot with, the state of Texas, and, obviously we have a regulatory environment that is very much built around the prevalence of the oil and gas industry. Are there certain things that might need to be changed to really enable the full vision of this hydrogen ecosystem? Maybe you could talk maybe at the state level at least.
I can mention that I got the job last April, so this is a very difficult question for me to address, and it comes from there.
Yeah.
I really don't have any deep comments on that, other than to say that in general, I think the state of Texas has been investing on renewables for quite some time. Wind generation in the state is one of the highest across the states, as far as I'm aware of.
That's right. Yeah.
And then we have a high level of activity with operators across the state. And what I have seen over the years is that at that level, people are for a good business case. And if you have a good business case and something that will work, people will engage on that. And what I have seen is relatively smaller operators that have been traditional in oil and gas approaching us, asking questions. What's this? How is it happening? What can we do with this? And I see that as a positive. Now, what's going to be the legislation behind that or the changes? I can't comment on that, but I'm optimistic. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. This might be the last thing we get to. We only have 2 minutes left here, but I want to touch a little bit on distribution. We've talked a lot about generation and storage, but not so much on distribution. Kathy, your customers presumably, or you guys in industry, you're generating this hydrogen. What do you do with it after you generate it? Where does it go?
Well, honestly, a lot of the reason people buy electrolyzers is because they want to generate it close to where they're using it. So that makes that particular story relatively easy. Although I would say that there are a lot of discussions around what are the best models. Do you put in one very large central electrolyzer and then have short distribution lengths from that? I would say some of the industrial gas companies currently, at least, are saying liquefaction is probably the way to go right now. But I know there's also a lot of research into other methods of storage, liquid organic carriers, cheaper high pressure tanks and things like that. But back to the policy side, that's going to depend also on what are the regulations for transport, in terms of carrying high pressure gases or flammable gases or whatever across roads and things like that.
Joaquin, you had a little bit on transport in your introduction. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think like Kathy mentioned, I think there's alternative ways that we can think about it. So one option is if you put the hydrogen onto some organic carrier, if you can then take it off on site, you could make the distribution process easier. That requires a few things, that you have not a lot of energy loss, basically hydrogenating the molecule on the front end and taking hydrogen off on the back end. So again, if you have better catalysts that are, good hydrogenation and dehydrogenation catalysts, unfortunately some of the best ones are also precious metals that could, open up some new opportunities.
Okay. Looks like we have one more question from the audience, and then we might have to wrap it up here. In Texas, does the Railroad Commission act as the regulatory body for hydrogen, similar to its regulatory mission for oil and natural gas? And I actually don't, I'm embarrassed, I don't know the answer to that. Do any of y'all know?
I think the Railroad Commission, in terms of wells, or for what you use them, they have like class 4 and so on, or things like that, where there are analogies between the two. But a well-defined set of rules, I'm not aware of that either. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Okay, well, we're just past noon here. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. I'd like to thank the panelists for taking the time to participate in this. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your good question and your attention. I hope you learned something here. I know I certainly did. And I'd like to just say thanks, and thanks for coming to Energy Week.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's lunchtime, so we have a 45-minute break as a programming note. See us back here at 12:45 for the next panel, which will be improving grid resilience. Also, we had a technology glitch yesterday from the MOVA auditorium to the YouTube stream. So it may have glitched and you may not have been able to watch that. If you want to see Bruce Niemeyer's talk about the future of energy, one of the easiest ways to do that is go into YouTube and then search on their search bar for UT Energy Week 2022, the future of energy. And that presentation recording should be there. So we will see you at 12:45. Thanks again.